Okay, we are going to do 2 chapters of Read Aloud today. The first is going to take place on Devlegan, now known as the Jolly Roger, and the second chapter we will be back with fan favorite Mrs. Bumbrake. So we'll read these two. Chapter 33 is called Worries. The ship formerly known as Devlegan and now as the Jolly Roger was ready to sail. The sails themselves looked a bit odd. The mollusks had made them by tightly weaving fibers stripped from the stem of a hardy, thick jungle plant they called salamander vine. The resulting sails were strong and supple, but Hook was not happy with the color. Not happy at all. "Pink?" he said upon first seeing them. "Pink?" The sails were, in fact, an especially bright shade of pink. "Yes, Captain," said Smee. "I think they're lovely." Hook slowly turned to face his first mate. This was usually a bad sign. "Smee," Hook said calmly. "Yes, Captain." "We are pirates, are we not?" "Yes, Captain." "So this is a pirate ship, is it not?" "Yes, Captain." "And when we as pirates bear down upon our victims at sea, what emotion do we want them to feel?" Smee frowned. "I don't know, Captain." "Fear, you idiot," bellowed Hook, nearly knocking Smee over. "We want them to be terrified of us, do you understand?" "Yes, Captain." "We want them to say, 'Oh no, pirates, we're doomed.'" "Yes, Captain." "We do not want them saying, 'Oh, look at the lovely pink sails.'" "Yes, Captain. I mean, no, Captain?" Hook went to Fighting Prawn to complain about the sails, but Fighting Prawn informed Hook that the sails could not be changed. "But what pirate ship has pink sails?" "Yours, apparently," said Fighting Prawn, displaying not the tiniest hint of a smile. Aside from this issue, the renovation and provisioning of the ship went smoothly. On the day it was to sail, Fighting Prawn and all of his warriors crossed the island's mountain ridge to gather at the pirate lagoon. They brought with them the shipwrecked men, Cheeky O'Neill, Frederick de Wolfe, Rufus Kelly, and Angus McPherson. The mollusks had been keeping the four under close watch in case they tried to avoid being put aboard the ship. The mollusks also brought Wendy. Fighting Prawn had told Hook earlier that he would be taking her to London. Hook reluctantly agreed. Fighting Prawn gave them no choice, but this was the first time he had seen his passenger. Like everyone else, he was struck by her resemblance to her mother, and unlike everyone else, Hook did not find this appealing. "You know, your mother caused me a lot of trouble, and you're causing me trouble." "I'm so sorry," said Wendy, without the hint of sounding sorry. Hook turned to Fighting Prawn and said, "It's bad luck, you know, a woman on a ship." That's actually a true fact. For some reason, pirates felt that women were bad luck on a ship. So much so that some of the two most famous lady pirates in history were known to disguise themselves as men aboard their ship. And they're kind of interesting to read about if you end up Googling them or something like that. Anyway. "If you fail to take her safely to London," said Fighting Prawn, "your luck will be very bad indeed. She will send me word when she arrives home, and if I do not hear from her—" He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Hook could hear. "I will hunt you down. Wherever you go in this world, I will find you. And you know me, Hook. You know I will do exactly as I say. I will find you and bring you back here, and Mr. Grin will finally finish that meal of his." Fighting Prawn nodded toward the jungle, which sometimes echoed with the roars of the giant crocodile. Hook pulled away. "I gave you my word, Prawn. I'll take her back." Fighting Prawn nodded. It was not Hook's word he trusted. It was the fear that he saw in Hook's eyes. The Jolly Roger was loaded with the final barrels of water and baskets of food. Then the passengers were ferried to the ship in the mollusk canoes. Fighting Prawn rode with Wendy, and as they neared the ship, he nudged her gently, glancing upward. Following his eyes, she saw one of the sails furled at the top, and poking out of them, just barely visible, was a tiny thatch of orange hair. She looked at Fighting Prawn and nodded. Once aboard the ship, they went below to Wendy's cabin. It was small, but comfortable enough. Fighting Prawn, after making sure that nobody was listening, said, "You will be safe here, Wendy. Hook will not dare harm you. The rest of the pirates are not such bad men, and you will not be alone. You have your friend in the sails, and Am assures me that the porpoises will stay close by until you get to England." Wendy gave the embarrassing mollusk chief a quick hug. Thank you for everything. They went back up onto the deck, and the 4 shipwreck survivors were just coming aboard. Cheeky O'Neill looked around at the ship, pausing to smirk at the pink sails. He walked confidently up to Hook, his huge frame towering over the pirate. They exchanged stares, each man taking an instant dislike to the other. So, Captain, where might our cabin be? Hook smiled unpleasantly. Oh, allow me to show you, he said, and he led O'Neill and the other 3 men down below, then down further still to a dark hold in the lowest, forwardmost part of the ship, below the waterline. You can't be serious, said O'Neill. I can't even stand in there. How unfortunate for you. We're not going in there. Oh, yes, you will, said a third voice, and it was Fighting Prawn. The mollusk chief had a half-dozen warriors with their spears at the ready. Huh, after you, sneered Hook, pointing to the hold, and one by one the 4 men went inside. O'Neill was last as he ducked his head to squeeze through the doorway. He turned to give both Hook and Fighting Prawn a look of pure hatred. Fighting Prawn felt glad to be getting this man off of the island. And when the 4 men were in the hold, Hook closed the door, slid the heavy iron bar in front of it, and the men were now prisoners. The door had a small barred opening, and O'Neill pressed his face against it. How long are you going to keep us in here? Until I decide to let you out, said Hook. Far from here, said Fighting Prawn. Here's Hook and O'Neill in O'Neill's new quarters with the bars. Oh, yes, said Hook. You're going to be in there quite a while. Hook turned back to the deck. He was followed by the mollusks. Fighting Prawn was the last to leave, and as he did, he glanced back at the hold. O'Neill had his face pressed against the bars, but now he was smiling. And an hour after dusk approached, the ship with Hook at the wheel set sail, its pink sails turning dramatically red by the setting sun. Fighting Prawn stood on the shore of the lagoon, watching the pirates as they scurried about the ship, responding to Hook's commands. A wiry figure appeared high in the sails, out of sight. Peter caught a glimpse of Fighting Prawn and waved quickly, then disappeared. Another figure stood on the deck next to the sail. It was Wendy, looking very small and very alone. She also waved. Fighting Prawn waved back. He believed he had done everything possible to ensure her safe passage. But he could not rid his mind of worries. Would Hook do as he said? Could Peter stay hidden? Would Wendy be all right? And why was O'Neill smiling? That's the end of chapter 33. We're on to chapter 34 called It's Here. For the 3rd time, Neville pressed the doorbell button of the Darling house, and as before, he heard the chimes echo inside, and no one came to the door. That's odd, he said, and he turned to John and Michael, who stood behind him on the doorstep. Your father said he'd been here. What about Mom? Said John. Yeah, agreed Michael. What about Mom? Neville frowned. He had forgotten that neither John nor Michael knew that their mother was missing. Your mother is on a trip. The boys continued to argue over where she was, which for once was fine with Neville, as it distracted them from the question of where their mother actually was. What bothered Neville was the absence of their father. George had been very insistent that Neville return his sons to London immediately, so why wasn't he here? After several more futile stabs at the doorbell, Neville put the boys back in a taxicab and had the driver wait. Neville gave him an address on Kensington Park Gardens. Where are we going now? Asked John. We're going to go to your grandfather's house, said Neville. Will Father be there? I don't know. We'll see. If all else fails, you can wait there until your father picks you up. And in 10 minutes, he was ringing the door of the Astor mansion. It was opened by Mrs. Bumbrake, whose face lit up at the sight of her visitors. Why, Mr. Plunkfenster, this is a surprise, she said. And John and Michael, what brings you here at this hour? We're looking for George. He's not at his house. George is our dad, explained Michael, but we don't call him George, because we call him Dad. She knows that, you ninny. I'm not a... All right, you two, snapped Neville, who had been listening to basically this same argument for several hours. You boys go play somewhere while I talk to Mrs. Bumbrake. There's tin soldiers in Lord Astor's study, said Mrs. Bumbrake, and the boys were delighted and scampered off. Mrs. Bumbrake turned a worried face to Neville. George isn't home? No, said Neville. I don't understand it. He told me to bring the boys home immediately. He's quite upset with me about Wendy going missing. Oh, I don't blame him, said Mrs. Bumbrake with a stern look. How could you, putting a girl on a flying machine? I didn't put her on it, protested Neville. She jumped aboard and flew off before I could stop her. But you should have seen how it flew. I had no idea it could... in any event, I had hoped to find George here. He's not here. I expected him. He's been coming by regularly to see Lord Astor, but he didn't come today. Where could he be? I don't know, but I'm worried. With Molly missing and now George... Now wait, said Neville. You don't know George is missing. Well, that's just it, said Mrs. Bumbrake. I don't know anything. So many strange things are happening. What strange things? I'll make some tea, said Mrs. Bumbrake. Tea was Mrs. Bumbrake's solution to everything. And in a few minutes they were sitting in the parlor over a pair of steaming cups. Mrs. Bumbrake told Neville about Wendy's visit, during which she apparently had told Lord Astor something that made him very upset. Upset about what? Said Neville. Mrs. Bumbrake considered the answer. Finally, she said, Do you know about the Starcatchers? Neville frowned. A little. Secret society, fighting evil magic. Hocus pocus, really. Unscientific. Leonard approached me about joining years ago, but I declined. I said I was too busy. To be honest, I thought it was kind of silly. It's not silly. It's real. What do you mean? The evil, it's real. I've seen it, and Lord Astor has been fighting it his whole life. He thought he'd won, but now it's come back. It's here, in London. I think that's why Molly's missing, and George as well. And Lord Astor, he's... Mrs. Bumbrake buried her face in her hands, stifling a sob. What about Lord Astor? Neville asked softly. Mrs. Bumbrake looked up. He's dying, she said. Oh dear, said Neville. Is there anything I can... Dr. Sable said at this point there's no use with us taking him to the hospital, and he doesn't want to go anyway. How much time does he have? Days, maybe hours. I fear he's going to die without ever seeing his family again, and the worst of it is he keeps calling for Molly. Actually, sometimes he calls for Molly, sometimes he calls for Wendy. Whichever it is, he wants to tell her something. He seems obsessed with it. Tell her what? I honestly don't know. He's delirious and very weak, so his words are unclear. But he keeps saying something about a sword. A sword? Does he own a sword? Maybe he wants to give it to one of his children or something. Not that I know of, and there's one other thing. What? Something about a meteorite. Meteorite? Are you quite certain? Yes, he's talked about it several times. What about a meteorite? I don't know. As I say, he's delirious. He just keeps repeating Molly's name, sometimes Wendy, sometimes a sword, and sometimes he's talking about a meteorite. He gets very upset, and then I lose him. Strange, said Neville. Whatever it is, said Mrs. Bumbrake, I think it's connected with the Starcatchers. But you can't possibly... Yes, I can. I know what I know. It has to do with the Starcatchers, I tell you, and Wendy's visit, and Molly's disappearance, and now George. The evil is back, Mr. Ploggenfenster. It's here. She glanced toward the parlor window. It's around this very house. What's around the house? I think we're being watched. I've seen men outside. Mrs. Bumbrake, it's London. There are lots of... No, these are men watching us. Bobby, some of them, watching at all hours. Neville nodded, but he was unconvinced. He was about to say something when John burst in the parlor, followed by Michael, who had his hand over his face. Michael put a soldier up his nose, announced John. Only his head, protested Michael. More like his whole body, said John, and it's stuck there. It's not, said Michael. Then pull it out if it's not stuck. I don't want to pull it out, said Michael. Neville and Mrs. Bumbrake exchanged a look. They lowered their voices and said, We can discuss this later. For now, the question is, what do we do with the boys until we find until this matter is straightened out? The boys will stay here, said Mrs. Bumbrake firmly, and so will you. But I had planned to... Mr. Ploggenfenster, surely you do not intend to leave me in this house with 2 children and Lord Astor in his current condition. Neville blinked. Of course not. Good, said Mrs. Bumbrake. Now let me see about the soldier in Michael's nose. And she ran from the table and headed toward the boys, and Neville rose also. He went to the window and looked out the curtains, looked out into the dark London night. The fog had crept in as usual, obscuring most of the street. The lone illumination came from a gas streetlight, casting a ghostly pale cone of light down on the sidewalk. And in the cone of light, facing the Astor house, was a bobby. and that's the end of the chapter. So as you remember, a bobby is just a slang word for a police officer in London. If you're interested in what Lord Astor is talking about with the sword, we know probably what sword he's talking about. But if you want to look up any information on meteorites, that might help in the coming chapters to figure out how maybe things falling from the sky help with the mystery that we keep getting deeper in. So we'll see you again for tomorrow's Read Aloud.